So thank you all first for agreeing to participate today. It's great to have everyone on the line. As you probably know, my name is Carissa Smith, and I've been working with David in particular to get you folks up and running with DSpaceDirect. I am joined today by Timothy Donahue, who is the technical lead for the DSpace open source project as well as the DSpaceDirect product, and also Valerie Hollister. And let me get over here. Valerie Hollister, who is the Director of Community Programs at DSpace, and I'll let them both introduce themselves in just one moment. I just wanted to preface today's training session and let you folks know that it is really intended to be more of a conversation. So please feel free, as Tim is going through his presentation and actually the live demonstration portion, to ask any questions that come up, or if you have something that's confusing, please ask for clarification. Again, it's really meant to be informal and to get you folks up and running your DSpace account. So feel free to jump in with any questions you may have. And for the most part, I'll be on mute and I'll let Tim take over, but I'm going to let Tim and Val introduce themselves, and I'll let Val go first, and then we'll get the presentation started.
Hi, everybody. This is Valerie Hollister. As Chris has said, I work with the community, the DSpace community, and help with programming for the community. I've been working actually with DSpace, people who use DSpace for the last 6 years, and I have a lot of knowledge about who's doing what with DSpace. So I think the way that I might be a good resource and useful to you is if you have things that you are thinking about putting into DSpace and you have questions about how others have done it, I may be able to connect you with other people in the community who have done similar things. So certainly am available too if you have any questions and need some help. You can certainly ping me, and I think my email isn't included in the presentation, but I will put it in the chat just in case. But at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Tim, who's going to be leading the training session.
Hello all, this is Tim Donahue, and I know I've talked to several of you via email already, but it's good to talk to you over voice and do this little getting started thing with you. As Chris had mentioned, feel free to ask questions anywhere within this. Just interrupt me. You can unmute yourself if you're on mute and just go ahead and ask a question right away. If you needed to, you can also use the chat window, and Chris or Val will let me know if you got a question, and stop me wherever I'm at so I can help answer it there. But without that all being said, we'll go ahead and get started. The way this presentation basically is set up is I'm going to kind of go through just some overarching sort of ideas around what a repository is, how you could potentially use DSpace, how some people already use DSpace at their institutions, and some of the basics about just kind of getting started, the structure, the hierarchy within DSpace. But the majority of what we'll actually be going through is a live walkthrough of just kind of starting to create content within DSpace. And I know for your example, of course, you all are coming with some content that we're working on migrating over, but this will give you a good idea of then how you can add even more content after that and how you can start to organize content within your DSpaceDirect instance. So we'll go ahead and get started here. First, we do like to kind of just give a basic intro of what we see as being the idea of a repository of where you're storing your content and what DSpace is really good at. And this is sort of the definitive quote around what a repository is. And I'm not really going to read this here, but I just wanted to point out the two different highlighted colors here, kind of showing there's two main points within this quote. The first thing is, of course, a repository is an actual system or a set of services to allow you to store and disseminate digital materials, whatever that digital format may be. But the other aspect of what a repository is it does involve setting up some local policies and making some commitments at your organization just around how you want to manage this content that you're going to be gathering, how you want to disseminate it out to other people, and who you want to be able to have access to it and who you want to be able to add content in. So there'll be a lot of areas where you can actually make these decisions within DSpace, and DSpace is built in such a way to allow you to make these local policy decisions. So at a more simplistic level, a repository in a lot of ways is just, capturing content, storing it, managing it within an online system, and being able to provide online access to that content. DSpace in particular will provide persistent URLs, which are actually a way to allow you to even move your repository to another location in the future and not have all of your links to individual metadata records or individual items all break on you. So you have this idea of this persistent URL which can point to your location, and even if your primary URL ends up changing, the persistent URL can point to the new location where that content has been moved to. A repository also is somewhat different than other sort of websites in that it really is built to support preservation level activities on content, making sure your content is safe and be able to increase visibility to it through web search engines like Google or Google Scholar or Yahoo or Bing or anything like that. And as I mentioned, it's all built around the idea, DSpace especially, of having some flexibility within it to allow you to meet your local policies and your local decisions on how you want to deal with this content, how you want to be able to make it available on the web. Just some very brief examples of stuff that people tend to put in DSpace, and this is a very small list of things that people have put in DSpace before. There's plenty of other things you can put in a repository system. One thing I did want to note here, just that we kind of tell all of our customers and make sure to let them know about, is just when you're putting copyrighted or published works into a repository system, you just need to take a little bit of care that you have the rights to redistribute that content, especially if you're allowing people to download it from your particular DSpaceDirect instance. We've not really had any instances of publishers coming after people because they've redistributed works that they weren't allowed to, but there is always the risk there that a publisher could potentially, if they own the copyright, complain or something along those lines. But there's a lot of other sort of stuff you can put in there, even beyond just those scholarly articles or published works. There's reports, conference materials, learning materials, data, audio, video, images, anything that you can really think of in terms of digital files you can put inside DSpace and make available to your users. But a few things that a repository is not, just in case you're wondering where the boundaries sort of are here. It's not a library catalog sort of system that allows you to actually manage anything like actual who gets to check out particular items or return particular items. Obviously, it doesn't manage anything like that. It doesn't manage websites to the extent of a web publishing platform, so it's not able to create a full-fledged website for you, or like a content management system. It cannot, create an entire content management system a la like WordPress or other tools like that. It's more about distributing content. It's also not a learning management system where you can actually create classwork out of it, or entire classes that people can sign up for, or a way to really manage any code. Not that not many people would do that in this sort of repository, but just worth noting that these are all systems that are somewhere around the realm of repositories, and they all can interact and complement a repository in a lot of ways, but they are a different type of system than what a digital repository is. So some of the basics now, getting more into DSpaceDirect and DSpace in particular. We're going to look at how DSpace stores its content and some of the ways that people use it at various institutions. So DSpace has this concept of three main content objects within it. There's the concept of a community, which generally speaking is usually corresponds to some sort of group, or it could be like a department at a university. It could be a research group. It could even be a subject area if you wanted to, but it basically groups together collections And you can have as many communities in your hierarchical structure as you want. The one limitation there is you have to at least have a top-level community at the very top to organize your collections within it. Collections then are where the actual groups of items, of works sit. So a collection in a lot of ways is very parallel to the idea of collections in libraries or archives, because that's where DSpace came out of. So collections is just kind of that you could group a collection of similar subject areas. You could group a collection of things that are all within the same journal. Maybe it's an actual journal issue and all of the items within it are articles. There's a lot of things you can do with collections, but basically collections are the place that you put your content items. And then content items are kind of what they would sound like. They're basically the documents within the system. They include metadata about what that actual work is, and they may include one or more files within it that can be downloaded from the web. Those files, it's worth noting in DSpace uses the word bit streams a lot within the actual administrative interface. You'll see that word come up. All that means is it's just files. It's PDFs, Word documents, PowerPoints, video, audio, anything along those lines. But this is the basic hierarchical structure. The main important point to come out of this with is that items always belong to a collection, and then a collection always needs to be grouped within some sort of community. But at the community level, you can create as many communities or sub-communities underneath that to more mirror the hierarchy that you want. And that hierarchy at some institutions can actually mirror their internal structure, so especially at universities. So here's some ways that you can then use that to mirror like organizational units. Some of this is a little bit more university specific, but it might give you some ideas to go from. So communities could be departments. You could have collections that correspond to research groups, or even a type of document like a thesis or a dissertation or white papers. A community could also just be more general grouping, like a grouping of faculty members, or it could even be, as you see down at the bottom there, the hierarchical structure. A sub-community or a top-level community could represent an entire journal, and you could have a collection that represents an issue, and then the articles that belong to that journal. So there's a lot of flexibility here in how you want to set up your DSpace instance. You just need to kind of decide how you want what you want communities to represent, and they could represent multiple things. And the same sort of thing with how you want to group items into different collections. It is worth noting here that items can actually belong to more than one collection, so you can have one particular item that is kind of linked to multiple collections if it belongs in multiple areas. But as of yet, right now, the rest of the hierarchy is more kind of a one-to-one basis with DSpace. So a collection right now only belongs to a single community. And same with sub-communities, they would only belong to a single community. But you're allowed to kind of set this up however you want. So before we get into the actual demonstration of creating some of this content within DSpace, I just wanted to kind of note here that these are some of the questions you might kind of ask internally as you're going through the process of kind of planning out how you want to organize your content. We have a much more details actually on this link down here below, which I'm going to actually be providing in the very next section once we go into the actual demo. And we will be sending out an email afterwards with all the links and a copy of this actual entire training session within it. But we've built a getting started knowledge base for DSpaceDirect that both helps you kind of plan for how you want to organize your content, as well as it has a little script, a how-to script of how you can add content into your system, which is much of what we're going to be going through now for the next period during this training session. So now we're going to jump over to the live walkthrough, which is going to be off of our demonstration site. If you had a computer handy, you could actually bring this up as well and kind of watch as I'm going through this. I am going to be logging in as the system administrator, so you won't be able to see all of these same screens from your local computer if you logged in as well, or if you visited the site as well. But after this training session is over, we will be sending you guys an actual administrative sort of test account that you could play around on this demo server and just create some dummy content to get a better idea of how you may want to, organize your content in your actual production system. So it just gives you a sandbox to sort of play in and decide how you want to use it. So we'll jump over here now to the demo. And I will pause here for a moment as I'm jumping over to let you ask any questions if there's anything that is pressing so far. I'm going to bump up the font here too. Whoop, let's go down one. Is this big enough?
I'm looking at this the website that you've cited here, the demo.DSpaceDirect.org.
Yep.
And what should I click on when I get to this page in order to follow along what you're doing there?
You can actually kind of follow along and see what I'm actually doing more through this actual demonstration. You won't be able to log in right now, but we will provide you a login after this demonstration is done, so you could actually go in and play around more and create your own dummy content. I just want to make it clear that this site is up and public, and you'll have access to it later on. But as of right now, it might be easier to just go ahead and watch what I'm doing as I'm doing it, so I can show you how to step through and log in and add content into the system and all of that, which is the next part here.
Just 2 notes. Tim, your screen looks perfect at that size. And I didn't mention at the beginning for you folks, but I am recording this session, hence why I paused or hit all the record buttons. And that'll be posted on the DSpaceDirect YouTube channel. So after today, if you have forgotten snippets of this demo, it will be available to you at all times. So just keep that in mind as well, that we'll have a recording up and available here later today or early tomorrow.
Ooh, so that means no more stupid questions.
And we also do, on this demo site, there's a link here that I'm pointing to, the DSpaceDirect knowledge base. That will actually bring you over to that knowledge base that I just mentioned, which actually has a getting started checklist on it that gives you some information about just starting to plan for how you might want to set up your DSpace instance and things you just might want to think about a little bit. And it also has the how-to script, which is basically how to do various things within DSpace, like adding content, creating communities and collections. And this is essentially the script that I'm going to be walking through right now and demoing to you guys. So you have this textual version of how to do all these things. But as Carissa mentioned, you also have access to the video, so you can go back and look at different points in the video to remember how to add content as needed. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and jump back over here to the demo site. As you see, there's a couple. I'm going to give you a little bit overview first as this from this front page. You can see there's a couple of communities to start with. This is just some dummy content that we've started to add to play around with and done inside different sort of demonstration sessions, different training sessions with other customers. But to give you a overarching view of this home page, all of the DSpace instances will look somewhat similar to this. You could have a different sort of header. The side menu may be slightly different looking, or the footer down at the bottom may be slightly different looking. But the content in general is going to be the same within any DSpace instance and within your DSpaceDirect instance. It's generally organized as sort of an introductory area here at the very top of the home page. This is actually totally customizable based on what sort of information you want to provide. It's sort of a place to be able to introduce people to the site when they come in. And as you can see, it can basically include anything you can do in sort of HTML on a web page. You can have links, you can have lists, formatted text, anything like that. The one thing to note, though, is that this is something that we actually have to set up for you, so we can work with you on what sort of content you want there and update it as needed, but it's usually not necessarily a live news area. It's more of just the basic introductory, here's what this site is about sort of thing. Below that is the top level communities. This is the very top of that hierarchy of communities and collections. So there is content underneath these, but it's just kind of giving you a view of the very upper level of what's in this DSpace instance. Then you have your search box here, lower than that, and at the very bottom of this page in the middle are the recent documents that have been added to this individual DSpace instance. And I'm going to come back and mention a little bit more about that after I show the sidebar off a little bit as well. On the sidebar, we have the search box. The sidebar stays the same on every single page within the DSpace site, and that's worth noting. And one thing in particular also worth noting is that the capabilities and the content of the sidebar, even though the boxes are essentially the same, the content of the sidebar is kind of context aware. It basically knows where you are within the DSpace site, and based on where you are in that site, it gives you different options based on that level of content that you're working with. So as a basic example, the search box at this home page is searching all of your DSpaceDirect content by default. So anything I type into that search box is going to search across everything there. But if I went down into an individual community, so if I jump down to this sample community, the search box then provides other options of being able to search within a particular area of DSpace. And you also notice some of the browse options have changed. So by default at the top level you can browse all of DSpace. Now I can browse just within this community. And there's even more options that end up changing down within this sidebar. There's this area of discovering content where you can actually jump directly to particular authors or subjects or date issued. And if I go to a different community, that content will actually change. So I'll go over to the department community, and now I have a different set of authors within this community, a different set of subjects, and a different date issued. The RSS feeds down here at the bottom are also context aware. They allow you to be able to provide an RSS feed if people wanted to use an RSS feed, any of your users or yourselves. It gives you a way to get notified of recent content that has come in. And so if you grab the RSS feed at the collection level or community level, it's only going to give you content that has been added within that part of the hierarchy. Whereas at the overarching home page, that RSS feed will give you all of the content within DSpace and the most recent content that's come in. Similarly, this recent submissions thing is also context aware. It's also going to only show submissions that have come into this area of the hierarchy. So for the Department of Physics, it's only showing a single document that has come in recently. But if I went back up to the home page, you'll see a larger listing of all of the content that has come in into any community or any collection within the system. So that kind of gives you a basic understanding of kind of just getting around the system in general, and the idea that the sidebar, the menus over on the side, are going to be pretty consistent within any page, but that yet they will provide you some additional options based on where you've browsed to within the system. So from there, we're going to go into actually logging into the system, and I'm going to show off a little bit of the features of what's provided after you've logged into the system. So you'll notice there's this My Account box here where you can log in or register with the system. There's also a login link in the top header that allows you to log in up there as well. Both of the same login process. The registration process I do want to briefly mention. It's basically provided as a way to allow people to quickly create accounts within your DSpaceDirect system. Anybody can register within your DSpaceDirect system, but by registering they actually don't get any extra special permissions. You have to provide them the permissions that you want them to have within their system. So I could be, Joe Schmo or Jane Doe anywhere within the US or anywhere in the world and come and register, but I wouldn't actually get any rights upon registering. All I have the ability to do is log in and kind of sign up for email notifications for new content that may be coming in to your DSpace system. But we're going to go ahead and log in now, and I'm going to log in as a site-wide administrative user. And I've just got an autocomplete here things because I have a hard time remembering passwords. So now I've logged in into the system, and you'll see a couple things have changed. We've got a profile link up here, and it just shows my name that I'm named Demo Administrator. I've also, my account area has changed slightly. It's gotten a few more options here. I can get to my profile. I can log out. If I've exported any content, I can go back to my export page to be able to download that content as needed. There's also a way, since I'm a site-wide administrator, to add new content in, and that's through that submissions link. And we'll go into that a little bit later as well. But one thing to note here is because I'm a site-wide administrative user, I've gotten some extra boxes here once I've logged in over here on the side. The one box that has appeared is the administrative box. This only appears for site-wide admin users. So any of your normal users would not necessarily see this. It's a kind of limited access rights, and it allows you to do much more in-depth changes within the system or go into tweaking things within the system at an administrative level. You also end up having, as a site-wide administrator, the ability to create brand new communities at this top level. So since I'm on the home page, I can create a community here, and that's what we're going to go through the process of doing here, is creating this new community within this DSpace instance. So communities within DSpace have some basic metadata that you need to provide. The only thing that is required is a name. So you just need some sort of unique name for this particular community. So for this example, I'm just going to create, let's do a different department here. Just do a mathematics department. The short description allows you to basically fill out a very short blurb, a description of what this community is about. If it's described within the name well enough, you really don't need to add a short description. And in all honesty, the short description really only comes into play when you're searching your DSpace instance or browsing around. So when you're browsing through the hierarchy of community and collections, you can get little short descriptions there. Or if I searched across content in DSpace, it's not only searching the items, the actual metadata of the items, but it also searches things like the community name, the community description, and stuff like that to try and find the content area that you want to jump to more immediately. So it's a totally optional field. You don't have to add it in. There's other fields here that are also completely optional, and you'll notice some of these actually say that you can add HTML. You don't have to add HTML, but if you're familiar with creating HTML tags, you're more than welcome to actually add HTML content into these areas. And DSpace is not smart enough here to actually auto-complete any of your HTML or do any sort of validation of your HTML in any way, shape, or form, but it just allows you a way to more customize these community pages. So for this example, let's go ahead and just add, this is the brief. I'm just going to add a little bit of content here so you get a sense of where this content comes into play on the community homepage. You can also add a copyright sort of statement for a community or even at a collection level. And this is more important if a community groups content that is under some sort of copyright restriction or needs some sort of special copyright statement. You can also add a copyright statement across the entire site. That's more in the footer of your particular DSpaceDirect site. If you wanted to say, you know, this all content is copyright so-and-so or whatever, you can do that site-wide, or you can do it within individual communities. Some instances where you may want to do it at a community level are if your institution has particular communities where those communities actually, the content within those communities is really owned by the institution, or maybe it's owned by a particular publisher because it represents some sort of journal or something like that. You could add a copyright statement saying everything within this community is copyright my institution or copyright this particular publisher or whatever. Again, it's totally optional. It's not usually very widely used, but it's there as an option.
Tim, may I ask a question here?
Sure.
When you do a search, like on the home page, a search of the entire site,
Yep.
You're typing in keywords or whatever, does it search text that you have entered here in the introductory text and the short description and that sort of thing? In other words, are you going to get results pointing to a general descriptive kind of web page rather than just content, specific items.
It will
so, for
search.
Example,
yeah, go ahead.
For example, on our for setting up the first community, let's say it's just child abuse, and then we have some text concerning what the content of that collection is, which includes forensic interviewing and mental health counseling. If somebody does a search on mental health counseling, are they going to get pointed to that introductory text, or are they just going to get documents that pertain to mental health counseling?
Yeah, it definitely, the search box definitely will search the name, and I believe it searches the short description. I actually need to go back and look to see if it searches these textual, the introductory text and the copyright and the news. I can answer that later on. I don't recall off the top of my head. It's actually a really good question.
Okay, so that's something we need to keep in mind when we're creating our site, because we don't want to have people do a search for forensic interviewing and just getting pointed to a web page on DSpace that says we have a bunch of stuff here related to forensic interviewing.
Right.
We only want them retrieving actual documents.
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, the search box will also go and search actual documents. So it returns.
Yeah, I understand that. I do.
Yeah, both of those. Yeah, and the actual documents it will return. It actually searches the entire metadata for the actual documents. Once we get down to adding an actual document, you'll see that it searches all of that.
Yeah, I'm not. Yeah, I know that. I just don't want it retrieving generic web pages that just say, we have a department, we have a community called forensic interviewing. Right.
Yeah, I can understand that, and I actually think, off the top of my head, I believe it definitely searches the name. I believe it searches short description, but I don't think it searches these HTML fields because it's not smart enough to take the HTML stuff out. So I think it skips those fields, if I recall correctly. But I need to go back and look it up and make sure, because I want to give you a correct answer on this. But I know that if we went and created mathematics and we go do a search just for mathematics, this department will come up because it's in that name. Mm-hmm. Even if we search math, it should come up. But I don't think if I searched intro, I don't think it'll actually pop up, because I think that's part of one of the fields it's not going to search. We could actually even try it after this and see what happens. Do a really live demo here. So in any case, so we have the introductory text, copyright text. The news is kind of an optional field as well. You can actually provide like a little news blurb at a community homepage if you wanted to. Some people use it. A lot of sites don't really use it at all, but it's another optional sort of area of text that you can add. And communities as well as collections can have a logo. Most people don't tend to use this very heavily unless a community or a collection corresponds to something like a journal, where there might actually be a logo associated with that journal, or something else that may have a logo associated. At big institutions, you don't tend to use it very heavily unless a department or a research group actually did have their own little logo that they thought was important enough to put there. But again, it's totally optional to add in. So I'm going to go ahead and create this community. And when I created this community, it jumps me directly into editing the community. And this is sometimes a little bit off-putting when you first start to use DSpace, because you may expect it to jump to the actual community homepage that we've now created. But the reason why it does this is because as an administrative user, it's giving you the option to immediately jump into assigning roles and permissions at this community. Or doing other sort of tasks with either the community or the collection. At the community level, it's really about assigning roles mostly. But I'm going to exit out of this briefly and we'll jump back to it. I just want to show you that the community was created. So we'll go back, and now we've got our community hierarchy. We've got the Department of Mathematics community. If I click on that community, you'll see here's where the intro text will show up, and again, that could be HTML. The news section, if you wanted it, shows up there, and you can then have a copyright statement at the bottom. If you wanted a logo, it would appear right up alongside the introductory text as well. So if I go back to the sample, this one actually has a logo associated with it, the DuraSpace logo, and it shows a little bit more of the fact that the intro text can actually have some formatting through HTML, and the news can, and even the copyright text can be formatted via HTML as well. That gives you a little bit of a sense there of what you can do with community home pages. But essentially the idea here is you're really just creating a splash page for that community, just so you can give a little bit of an introduction to it. Let's go ahead and go back and let's search. So I search mathematics now. Since I don't have any documents related to mathematics, it's just going to give me a link to that community. But if I go back and search, let's search intro, which was in that introductory text. I'm thinking it's not, oh, it did find it. So it is searching that intro text as well. It found the word intro in that intro text. Yeah. So it is good to know for that it's going to locate it. But it does note here in the search results, it does note that these are communities and collections. If it also matched items, so I know we have a, let's see, I'll just search sample because I think we have some things called sample in here. Yeah, so we got 10 results for sample. 2 of them were communities or collections, and it bolds where it matched. But then after that, it immediately shows the individual items that match that query as well. So if your users really don't care as much about the communities or collections, it does try and note which ones are communities and collections and which ones are actual documents within the system to try and make it easier to get right to the documents. Okay, so let's go back to our list of communities. We're going to jump back into the Department of Mathematics. Okay, so here's our new community that we just created. The context menu over here, because I'm now at a community level, it's giving me different options based on my permissions. Since I'm a site-wide administrator, I can do different things here like create a collection underneath this community, create a sub-community. I can also go back and edit this community or do some exporting tasks, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. Right now I'm going to go back and edit this particular community just to show off the roles feature here. Again, here you have all that information initially entered. You can edit anything that you want at any point in time, so you don't have, none of this is finalized. You can remove stuff. You can delete the community if you needed to. But at a roles level, you can also assign a community administrative role. This basically allows you to kind of delegate some administrative duties down to individual sort of community owners in a way. And there's a little blurb about what exactly a community administrator can do. But the idea is essentially they have full administrative rights on this particular community and anything below that community within the hierarchy. So that includes collections within that community, also items within any collection within the community. So it basically allows you to kind of start to split up your site if you wanted to give different people different administrative rights. You don't have to use this. You can have everybody be site-wide administrators if you wanted to, but it's a very powerful feature within DSpace to allow you to kind of give administrative permissions at different levels. And so I'm going to talk more later on about how to actually add accounts to DSpace and how to add other groups. But this just gives you an idea that once you have accounts or groups within the system, you could then create an administrative group if you wanted to and add people or groups to it to give them admin rights within this community. And one thing to note here is that you'll notice when I created that admin group, it gave me a kind of weird looking group name here within DSpace. This is just how DSpace manages its roles within individual communities or collections. It essentially tries to create an auto-named group that you cannot change the name of, so this field's grayed out. That kind of tells you what that group's about. So it lets you know it's an administrator group, and it tells you right here what community or collection is related to. In this case, it's related to the Department of Mathematics. And so you can actually add individual people to this group to give them admin rights within the community, or even groups to give an entire group admin rights within that community. But for this purpose, I'm going to just cancel out. I just wanted to give you a quick overview of that capability within DSpace. There's also a Curate tab within communities. Essentially what this provides is some various sort of like scripts that you can run that provide some reporting tools or even some other sort of administrative options within them. By default, there's not a whole lot that's really provided here within DSpace other than some reporting tools. So it allows you to kind of run a couple reports across content within this community. The first report here, this profile bitstream formats, as I mentioned, bitstream is just a file. So it's basically going to give you a report back of the number of PDF documents or Word documents or the types of files that you have within this particular community, which can be very useful if you're wanting to just see what content you have, which is actually sometimes of interest to people, whether people are adding more PDFs versus Word documents or PowerPoints or video or audio. It gives you a nice quick summary of what type of content is within this particular community. And you can do that at any community level or even at a collection level. You can also check for required metadata. And so this basically goes through all of the items within this anywhere underneath the hierarchy of this community and checks to make sure all of the required metadata fields are already filled out. This is sometimes important for instances of actually moving content from a different system, like I know we're doing for you guys specifically, where we can actually check to make sure all the required metadata fields are auto-filled out, and it'll warn you if something is not filled out. DSpace doesn't have a whole lot of required metadata fields by default. It's something that you can actually choose for us to enhance later on for your individual DSpaceDirect instance, and that's also where this can come into play. And finally, there's the ability to check links within metadata. So if your metadata includes a lot of HTTP links or links off to other content, this can be a way to get a report really quickly of whether or not any of those links are now broken. If the website it was pointing to no longer exists, you can run this report and it'll let you know if it's encountered something that is broken along the way. So that's another sort of basic report that's available. If with DSpaceDirect, if you ever decided you wanted to also purchase DuraCloud for backup purposes, there's another whole set of tasks that you can run here, which essentially allows you to run automated backups and automated restores from this user interface for your content. And that provides a lot of options here around managing those backups essentially. I'm not going to go through those here because I know you guys are not working with that right now. And so that's something we can go in much more detail if you ever decide you wanted to purchase DuraCloud as well. Just wanted to note it's here as an option as well. So exiting from this then, we're going to go back. We've created a community. Let me return back actually. Go back to our community homepage. And from underneath this community, we're actually going to go and create a collection. Creating a sub-community at this level is the exact same as creating a community. It's just a community that happens to be within another community. Collections are actually extremely similar as well. So when we go in and actually create a collection, you're going to notice a lot of the exact same metadata fields. Again, the name of the collection is the only thing that's required here, and everything else is completely optional. So for this purpose, let's put in. So we'll create a collection of mathematics white papers inside the Department of Mathematics community. As I mentioned, all these fields are optional, so I'm going to leave most of them blank here. There's a couple new fields at the collection level. One of them is that you can have a custom license for individual collections. By default within DSpace, as we had mentioned when you kind of started the sign-up process, as Carissa would have mentioned, we recommend creating some sort of deposit license, essentially, that people need to sign off on whenever they deposit new content within your system. At a collection level, since you're depositing content always within a collection, you can have a custom deposit license on individual collections. It tends to not be used very widely, but in some cases it's really important, like for the example of where a collection might actually represent a journal issue or something like that. You might need a very custom deposit license to ensure that you're that people are signing off and giving you the proper rights that you need when they're actually depositing content. So it's an option here.
Can
probably
I
won't
ask
use
a
it
question
widely.
here?
Sure. Go ahead.
If you have a community or department or whatever, is it obligatory to create a collection? In other words, can you simply have documents under a community?
No, that's part of the hierarchy that I kind of explained a little bit earlier with that diagram inside the slides. You always need to have a collection
I just
within the community.
didn't know if it was obligatory to create collections. So
Yes.
Can you have a collection under a community? Do you have to have departments?
Well, departments are just something that you could use a community for. The only things that exist are there's communities, collections, and items. And so what I created as what I called Department of Mathematics, that's just what I named a community. It's not really a department in any way, but it is obligatory that you need to have a top-level community, at least one community there, and then collections can only belong to a community. So you need to have a community there in order to create a collection, and you need to always have a collection to put items in.
I understand.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have to have a level that is the collections level.
Yes.
You can't just put documents under the community.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a common sort of point of confusion sometimes with DSpace. But yeah, you at least have to have those three levels. You have to have a community, you have to have a collection, and then you can put items underneath that collection. But you have to have at least one community, and you have to have at least one collection underneath that community in order to add content.
Okay.
And that's just how DSpace was created to begin with. So it's possible in the future someday it will change, but it's not the way it is at this point in time. So yeah, at the collection level, then that's where you can actually customize a deposit license if you wanted to. There's also this field that is a provenance field. This is basically an administrative-only field. Users never see this field. It's never searched or anything like that. It's basically for kind of administrative notes at a community level. It's not necessarily used very frequently, but it can be very useful if you really wanted to add a note about this collection that said, where the collection came from, perhaps, or maybe some sort of just general notes that are of use to your administrators. It basically is a place that you can just add notes to other administrators or notes to yourself for the next time you visit this collection and edit it. It just gives you some information there. It's totally optional again, just an admin field that you can fill out if you wanted to. And again, collections can actually have logos as well. Again, it's completely optional, but we offer that as well as a feature that you can have individual collections that are themed in some way with their own logo. But for this purpose, I'm just going to create a very simple collection just with a name, just so we can start to create content in here. Okay, and again, I jump back to the Edit Collection page so that I can immediately start to assign roles and do other things within this collection after it's been created. One thing you're going to note right away is that there's many more roles at the collection level, and that's because this is where you're actually dealing with that content that's coming into the system. So there's a lot more rights and permissions you can give to people based on that content. You still do have an administrative role, so you can create collection level administrators as well. You don't necessarily always have to create community administrators or site administrators. If you wanted to give somebody only admin rights on stuff that's in a very specific collection, you can add them to a collection administrators group. There's also some additional rights that you can provide at the collection level. There's a submitters group where these people have the ability to add content to that collection. So when they log in to the DSpace system, they would actually be able to select this particular collection from their submissions area. And I'll show what that looks like when we add content as our next example. But that gives them rights to add content to a collection. Any administrator can also add content, so they don't need to be a member of both of these groups if you wanted to give them admin rights. There's a default read access group, which allows you to basically specify that any items that are added to this particular collection could be access restricted in some way. By default in DSpace, when you add content to a collection, it's publicly available, so people can find it on the DSpace website, on your DSpaceDirect website. They could download the files that are associated with it, or read the metadata, or click on links. But if you wanted to, you could actually limit an entire collection of content via this option here, where you can actually restrict it so that it's only accessible, the files are only accessible to a particular group of users or something of that nature. This only restricts the files, so the metadata will always be publicly available, but it restricts who can actually download and read the individual files. And it is worth noting, if you've already added content to the collection, it doesn't go back and change the access rights of existing content in the collection. You'd have to go back to that existing content and tweak those rights one by one, or there's a batch tool that allows you to edit those rights once you've created a collection. Go ahead there. Is there a question? Okay. There's 3 other groups here at the bottom here that are related to actually providing an accept-reject sort of workflow process around content coming into a collection. By default, if somebody was to submit a particular item to a collection within DSpace, as soon as their entire submission process is complete, it would become publicly available, assuming that there's no review process in place. But these allow you to actually put a review process in place. So there's up to 3 steps of review that can take place within a particular collection. Essentially, these steps always happen in this order, but you can select whether you want 1 step to occur, 2 steps, or 3 steps. It's up to you how you want it to work for individual collections. But when you add a group or an individual user to one of these steps, say this accept-reject step, if I added Val to this accept-reject step for this particular collection, then as soon as a new document was added to this collection, Val would get an email, an automated email saying, we need you to review this particular document to see if it's okay to make publicly available, essentially, and she'd get an option to just accept it or reject it. If she rejected it, then the initial person who deposited that item would get an email back saying it was rejected and here's the reasons why. She would have entered some sort of reason why. If she accepted it, as long as there were no other steps afterwards, it would become, again, immediately publicly available. But you could add additional steps as you need to based on your local policies and workflows. You could add a step having to do with accepting, rejecting, or actually being able to tweak the metadata that the original depositor entered. Or you can add a step at the very end where somebody may just want to clean up the metadata, but it's assumed that that item is already okay to get into this collection. It's had enough of a review beforehand, or you don't really care about reviewing for accepting, rejecting, but you just want to make sure to clean up metadata before it becomes public. So those are all optional steps that you can add to the collection approval workflow process, and you can add them on a collection-by-collection basis. So from there, let's see, the other tabs here, we have the same Curate tab at the collection level. It provides the exact same options as the community level, so I'm not going to touch upon that. But there is a Content Source tab here that I'm going to just briefly mention. Most of our DSpaceDirect sites really aren't going to use this much because you're really dealing with standard collections, but essentially there's 2 different options. There's a standard DSpace collection where basically you're just going to add your content into DSpace as one normally would. Or there's the option to actually create a collection that harvests all of its content from an external location. And just as a side note, this is exactly what I did with your particular instance of the CWIS system that you guys were migrating from. I basically migrated through DSpace using this harvesting option, but basically allows you to create collections within your DSpace that harvest from an external location and keep it up to date if you wanted to based on the external location, or just do a one-time harvest. It's really not used very widely except by institutions who want to create a DSpace that kind of is sort of gathering content from many different other places out on the web. It's rarely used, but it's an important option to mention.
There's a common use of it in health sciences libraries, and I don't know whether we might want to use this or not, but for example, in health sciences libraries, they very commonly harvest records from PubMed Central of all of the publications from faculty at their own institution.
Okay.
And deposit those directly into their repository since they are in the public domain once they go into PubMed Central. And so they have it set up so that they'll harvest like monthly the records into their repository. I don't know whether we would ever set something like that up or not. A lot gets published on child abuse and neglect in PubMed Central, and so it may be something we'd want to consider. But of course, if we decide we want to do that, we'll need to get you to set it up for us.
Yeah, and it's also worth mentioning here, the harvesting from an external source, you actually could set it up yourself, but right now by default with DSpace, it only harvests it only harvests metadata. So it won't actually pull down files. So if you pointed at PubMed Central, it could grab the metadata for those particular articles that you wanted, but it would just grab the metadata along with a link to where it exists on PubMed Central. So that's how it kind of works with DSpace. And it is something that you could add yourself. And I'm not going to do it right here just because we're trying to add some. I'm going to go show a demo of adding actual item. And if I flip it over to this option, then it's going to only give me harvesting options. But that's just worth noting as to how you could use it in the future if you wanted. Okay, so that's creating a collection. And now I'm going to head back here to our list of communities and collections. So we've got our community we created. We've got one collection underneath it. And now we're going to go ahead and actually submit some content into DSpace. It's worth noting there's a couple places you can do that. If you have rights to submit to a particular collection, when you browse to the collection page, you'll actually see a link here to actually submit a new item to that particular collection. If you were not given those submitter rights or you're not an administrator, then that link would not appear there. There would be no option for that. The other way to actually submit content into a particular collection is you can go into your My Account area and click on the Submissions link. And this will basically give you a listing of everything that you've started but not completed. So there's stuff here that's unfinished for me. It's just stuff I was playing around with at one point in time. It gives me a list of everything I've finished and is now in the archive. So it's a submission that I did previously, and it's now in DSpace, and it's live and available in the archive. It also provides me a link up here to create a brand new submission where I can restart any of these that I had previously started but I had saved and hadn't completed. So just for this sample purpose, I'm going to just start a new submission from this screen. And here again, it's going to give me a list of the collections I have rights to actually put content into. Since I'm an administrator, I see actually all the collections that exist within this demo site right now. But if I was at a lower level user account, I may only see one collection or a couple collections here. So we're going to go ahead and put something in this mathematics field for now. And now here's the default DSpace submission process, and this is how things lay out when you're adding content into the DSpace system. It's a multi-stage process here, so you can see all the steps of this workflow along the top. And these stages can be tweaked or rearranged, or you can kind of add or remove a couple stages here and there if you wanted us to. We're working on the pricing model for some of that because those are things that we need to do a little bit more behind the scenes with DSpaceDirect. But it is an option to be able to kind of rearrange steps a little bit or kind of add new metadata fields if it's necessary. But this is the default process, and it tends to work for a large majority of people who use DSpace, which is why it has become the default. So we start off here with just a basic initial questions page, which kind of just is trying to gather some basic information so that it knows what sort of metadata fields to ask you about. And this is just the standard sort of couple questions that it's going to ask. So these are totally optional. We don't have to check either one of these, and I'm going to actually leave them both unchecked. And I'll mention the few metadata fields and areas that are required through this process as we go. So the first page of metadata has
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Can we go back to that one page?
Sure.
Can we go back to that page where it's asking the two questions?
Yeah, let me just enter something. It's going to require me to add a title before I jump back, but I can click back here now. Go ahead. What was your question?
The option for published, this item has been published or publicly distributed before.
Yep.
If you are linking to a document, like a document that was created by and is hosted at a government agency.
Yep.
Is that something you're going to indicate it has been published or publicly distributed before?
Yes. Yeah, you probably would. Essentially what this option gives you, when you click that it's been published before, a couple extra metadata fields are going to appear in the next screen. So now if I go forward here, before there was not a date of issue here. If it hasn't been published before, then it's assumed that the first sort of unofficial publication is putting it into DSpace. So it's going to add the date of issue, the date it was published, as being the current date, today's date.
Okay.
And it's also now added a publisher field. So if I go back to our initial questions, it's going to require this date now, because that's one thing that is required. Now I'll jump back. So if I uncheck this, so I can jump back and forth in this process, as you can see, and it's going to tell me now if I uncheck this checkbox, it's going to remove that date that I just added there. But if I uncheck the checkbox and went back forward, the date field is gone, the publisher field is gone. So some things are not, it's basically trying to give you a much more simplistic way of getting stuff into the system. But if things have been put up elsewhere, you're pretty much always going to want to check that box, so that then you can add the actual date it was truly published, if it was something that was put out in 2011. The only thing that's required here on the date is the actual year. You can add the month and day if you know it. And then the publisher is an optional field if there actually is an official publisher of that particular thing out there on the web. So that's just how you use that field. Yeah. So the only fields that are required when you're adding new content to DSpace is you always need to have a title, and there always needs to be a date that thing was created. By default, that date is going to be today's date unless you say it was published before, in which case you have to enter something. So I'm going to enter in a better title than a test title here. So I got this example of mathematics. Let's just say this is a mathematical theory. So just some sort of title needs to be there. Authors are even optional. Some things don't even have authors necessarily associated with them, but I'll go ahead and add myself as an author. Any of these fields that have an add button next to them, it immediately means that you can add it multiple times. So there's multiple values that you can create here. So I've added myself. I could then add Valerie in. Filter out before. Okay. So I've got a couple authors. I've got a title. I've got a date issued. Everything else on this page is completely optional. I can enter in a publisher. If there's some sort of standard way of citing this particular published item before, then I could enter in a citation to this particular thing. So if there's like a page number that it was in a journal or an art or anything like that, you can add that into that citation field. If it belongs to some sort of reporting report series, you can add the series name or the report number. And again, multiple of those are available. You can add any sort of identifiers, including an actual URI or URL, like a web page link. You could add a government document number, ISBN for books, any sort of identifiers relating to that document. There's also types of content within DSpace, so various types of content that you're adding in, and you can select multiple of these, like it says, by holding down either Control or Shift on your keyboard. So right now I'm holding down Control, and if I click on other ones, I can add more or unselect them. And then you can add a language that the material was written in as well. Again, all of these fields are completely optional other than the title and the date.
Tim, most
Sure.
of these look like Dublin Core type things.
Yep.
Is there the capability of modifying or adding to the things that are available here that are automatically displayed? I mean, can we add supplement the Dublin Core selections that are on the page here?
Yes, you can, although that has to be done through us at this point in time because a lot of that is a back-end configuration. So depending on how much you're wanting to add or supplement, we may need to figure out what sort of costs it may look like. If they're minor changes, it may not be a big deal, but that's something we need to cost out. But yes, it is possible to add completely new metadata fields here. It's also possible to request that additional types be added to this particular list or additional languages be added to this list. All of this stuff can be tweaked on the back end, but it's stuff that DuraSpace has to do because it is a back end tweak that needs to happen. So currently there's no way to do it from the admin user interface here.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. And at any time during this process, I can save and exit and complete this later on. As you saw, I had a couple incomplete submissions or incomplete submissions that I could continue through the process. So if I saved and exited here, I could come back in and start right where I left off. Additionally, whenever I click a button to go to the next page, or if I went and jumped back to a previous page, it's always saving what I currently have. So if I were to leave my computer right now, if I got distracted by a phone call or had to go off to a meeting and I forgot to hit that save and exit button, I will have already saved everything up to this point, and I could go back and log back in and start right where I had left off. So DSpace has a second describe page. It's more metadata fields, and again, it is storing these fields in Dublin Core behind the scenes, but it's just trying to give us a prettier interface to start with. And it only separates these fields on multiple pages because it's just trying to give you a little bit less scrolling on an individual page. There is also an option to kind of stick it all onto one page if you wanted to. A lot of these things can be tweaked, but again, they're all things that would have to be tweaked through DuraSpace at this point in time until DSpace has a feature to offer it from the admin interface. The subjects, again, you can add multiple subject keywords. DSpace does come with a very basic subject category area. It's not very broad in its categories at this point in time because we're not allowed by copyright restrictions to redistribute a lot of the major subject category sort of listings like Library of Congress and things like that. So this is a very broad listing of various subject areas that you could open up and select from and all that sort of stuff. Or you can just manually enter in particular subject areas by hand and add more than one as you see fit here. There's also.
Is it possible to edit that? Is it possible to edit that subject category list? In other words, if we had our own list, our own taxonomy of terminology, could we substitute our own taxonomy of terminology for the subject categories that are listed there?
Currently in DSpace, that's something that, again, we'd have to do behind the scenes. Unfortunately, a lot of these tweaks of these entry forms, they are able to be tweaked, but it's all like stuff that we have to do in configuration files underneath. So DSpace has been working towards making more of these features available as administrative tools so you can actually do them from the website itself. But those features aren't in DSpace yet. So while yes, you could have a tweaked list of subject categories, that's something you'd have to work with DuraSpace to put in place and to update as needed. So it's not something that we can manage from the user interface yet.
Yeah. Just out of curiosity, from your perspective, is that something that would take a lot of time or effort if we were to provide a list of, say, a dozen subject categories that we would prefer to use instead of the standard list?
As long as they were relatively standard subject categories, it shouldn't be a big deal to put them into place. It's just a matter of how often you would need to update them, because each time would take a little bit of work, little by little. So
yeah, well, for us it would be
something we'd have to figure out.
Specialized terminology. It would be like child neglect and emotional abuse and sexual abuse and stuff. Terminology that we use instead of. We don't need any stuff on mathematics, for example.
Yep.
But so, okay.
Yeah, so that is something we could work with you on. I can't quote how much work it would be without having a better understanding of how many categories you'd want and how that would work. So we'd have to look at it more for that specific scenario. But it is possible to have it tweaked and we could get a quote to you guys on how best to do that.
Okay.
Okay. So and so you can add multiple subject keywords here. Obviously, all of these metadata fields that we're entering are searchable from the search box later on, and you can actually do more specific searches just based on subject. And of course, they all pop up in the browse by options. And
I'm sorry. I need to ask you one more question here.
Sure.
Can you select multiple subject categories?
Yeah.
The drop-down list, it looks like a list of links, but can you select multiple links?
You can add them each one by one. So I selected one here.
Oh, okay. I can
add that.
All
and
right.
then I can grab another one and add that. So,
I see. Okay.
Yeah, so you can keep adding multiple of them little by little.
So, Tim, we have another question just for clarification. We see that the list is there and that you have the ability to type, but can you only type what's in the list? Or, so let's use child abuse. Could we put child abuse although it was not in the list?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you can type whatever you want into that text box. So yeah, if you had standard words or phrases you wanted to use and you just trained each of the people who are depositing stuff to use those standard phrases, you can just enter them into that box and hit add. So that's another way of doing it completely as well. So yeah, that box is free text. You can put whatever you want, as many words as you want, and however you want to structure it. As you can see, some of these have like even colons in them and stuff like that. If you wanted to actually put in Library of Congress subject headings, you could write out the whole subject heading there if you wanted. It's up to you. So then you also have an abstract. Of course, the abstract, all these fields will appear on the item page itself, and all of them are searchable both through the search engine within DSpace, and DSpace also does a good job of making all of this metadata searchable through Google, Yahoo, Google Scholar, all that sort of stuff to try and make it as findable as possible out on the web. So just to enter in some dummy text here. If there's any sponsors, you can add that there. Description other than the basic abstract, as well as optional. All these fields, again, are optional. The only ones that were required were the title and the date. Okay, now we get to the spot where you can actually then upload content files. So if this was a PDF or a Word document or whatever, you can actually choose the file on your file system and upload it here. This is also optional though, so if you were providing a URL or something in one of those metadata fields, if you were linking off elsewhere, you could just skip this step altogether. You don't have to upload it.
Is there a field for adding a URL?
Yes, if we go back, I must have the wrong settings here.
Okay, maybe I missed it, but
I'll go back to it. Field. Let me just open up my PowerPoint that I was just presenting here, and I will upload my PowerPoint. And then let's go back to let me jump back. It's this identifiers field. Essentially, you'd enter that in as a URI or URL, and you could paste it into here.
Oh, okay.
That's where you would put in an actual URL to content. That's where we'd recommend. But yeah, if there's content that you want to upload, you can upload individual files from this upload screen. And when you're uploading individual files, there's an option here. I'm not sure that you guys would use this at all, but it's very important for some institutions to be able to embargo content, which basically means that the content file itself cannot be downloaded until a certain date has passed. And so this is extremely useful for institutions that have like students that are submitting dissertations or something where their dissertation it may be public record only after the student has officially graduated, and maybe it's not allowed to be downloaded until a year after that or something. Or sometimes individual publishers, if you're actually working with a publisher, they'll sometimes have embargo rules and restrictions where they'll allow you to make a published article available on your own website or in your repository after a certain period of time has passed. And this lets you upload the file immediately, but specify to DSpace that please don't make this downloadable until this particular date has passed. So it's totally optional again, and if you enter in an embargo date, then it's recommended to add some sort of reason behind that embargo so that you can remember why that is embargoed if you went back later on and got confused. Those files are downloadable to administrative users, but by embargoing them, they're not downloadable to the general public. They'll basically just get to a screen that says you don't have access, this is under embargo until, and it'll give them the date that it will be available. So those are all optional as well. You can add multiple files here if you wanted to. Again, you don't have to even add a file if you didn't want to. So the the second to last step here is reviewing all the fields that you've entered already, and you can go back to any of those steps beforehand and correct something if something is incorrect or whatever you need to do. And then we'll go on to the next step from the review. Here's where that deposit license comes into play. So the deposit license is required for everybody to grant, to sign off on, in order to complete a submission into your DSpace system. And essentially this deposit license is usually meant to kind of grant you some safety mechanisms, especially if you let general users add content into DSpace. I'm not sure if it's applicable as much to your institution, but at universities sometimes they'll actually let individual professors or even sometimes students add content to the DSpace, in which case they want to validate that they have the rights to be able to do things like reproduce, translate the content, or redistribute it through the web. And so they're basically, through this distribution license, they're making sure that that they're kind of covered in case somebody comes and complains and says you need to take that content down. But the deposit license is an important aspect. Go ahead. Yeah.
Part of the terminology in this, you say that you have to sign off on this on every single item, but some of this does not apply to every single item. So, for example, you represent the submission as your original work. Well, if what you're doing is creating metadata linking to a document that's at a federal agency, it's not your original work, but you have the right to link to that because it's in the public domain. So, you know,
right.
If you check off on this, you're saying that it's your original work when in fact it's not.
This deposit license is totally customizable to you guys. This is the sample one. So you're allowed to tweak this however you want, and you could even change the language entirely if you wanted to. Essentially, anything from this note all the way down to the bottom here. This is a customizable area that you can basically add whatever deposit license you want. We had, during the setup process for DSpaceDirect, I know Chris had sent you some different questions of things you might or might want to do, and one of them includes the deposit license text. So you can tweak this however you want for your own purposes for the type of content that you're adding in to DSpace. You can also have different deposit license on different collections. So when I had shown creating the collection, there was that license field within that within a collection by collection basis, where you can basically add text into that license field, and whatever text you add replaces what is here in this license area. So you can have collections that have specific licenses as well. Okay. But the general end point is that DSpace does require granting some sort of license in this last step.
So the documents, the metadata that has been migrated from CWIS into your test server at this point, have they automatically been stamped as having agreed to this license, or how? I mean, would we need to go back and revisit every single document to determine what license we want to apply to that particular document?
No. Well, it's a two-part thing. First, they're not automatically stamped with this license because nobody really officially added the license per se. We just migrated the content. However, they were stamped as being migrated from the CWIS system. So there's an automatic, during that migration process, during that harvest process, DSpace automatically noted where the item came from and that it was harvested on a particular date into this DSpaceDirect system, essentially. So inside the metadata, and I'll show you that once we'll go and edit an item after we're done adding one here, and you can see that there's some automated metadata fields that DSpace manages within itself. One of those metadata fields includes provenance information. So in the case of that migration, there will be provenance information about where that content came from, in case you wonder later on why there isn't a license there. It's because it'll tell you.
Okay, so if we, assuming that we do want to tweak the distribution license so it doesn't look like we're claiming that every single item we created brand new, can we retroactively apply the new license to all of those CWIS documents that got migrated sort of as a bulk process? I'm not really wanting us to have to go back and edit every single record for every single item.
Yeah. Good question. I'll have to look into that and get back to you.
Okay.
I think there might be a way to do it, but I'm trying to remember how it works. So I'll have to look into it and get back to you on that. But I can let you know.
Normally, like if we harvest an item from PubMed Central, for example.
Yep.
It would indicate in the metadata that it was harvested and the provenance, and so it would not have a license attached to it unless we specifically went back to it and did that.
Correct. Yeah, and that's kind of how the CWIS stuff has come across as well right now, is that it's noted as being harvested from that other repository system, and when it was harvested and all that sort of stuff, but it doesn't have a license associated by default because it was pulled in from an external system. And yeah, these licenses more are about the content coming into your system that's more like files, essentially. They're not usually used as heavily for metadata, because if you notice even the text of this license, maybe it's not as explicit as that. Yeah, it's talking a little bit about like audio, video, and electronic format of files. It's more about the files that somebody has added into this particular deposit. So it's really trying to protect you around if somebody puts a file up inside your DSpace and it's something that's under copyright or whatever. It's trying to protect you so that you don't get into your entire DSpace site doesn't get sued, but rather you can say, oh, as far as we knew, this particular person was adding content that they were allowed to, but I guess they weren't, so we'll just take it down, or something like that. That's how a lot of institutions use this particular license. It gives them a safety net that if a publisher ever came and said, you need to take down this PDF or something like that because we own the copyright and you don't, then the institution can then say, okay, well, it looks like it was uploaded by this professor, and as far as we knew, he had the rights to upload it, but since he didn't have the rights to upload it, we'll just take it down and everything's okay. And then that kind of, resolves that situation rather than the publisher going further than that. So it's kind of trying to keep the blame off of the institution a little bit.
And and certainly you do want to CYA on all of this stuff, and try and conform to all of the copyright requirements and that sort of thing. What experience have you had with institutions that do want to include documents that are in the public domain or items that they link out to where, we are not specifically responsible for the content itself. We're simply providing a link to it and making it accessible to our customers, our clientele. And so you say you can have more than one license, and you can select which license you want to apply to a particular metadata record. Is that correct?
No, the license goes with the collection, essentially. So you can have different licenses for different collections. If you wanted to do it that way, so you could have a collection of materials that are coming from PubMed.
The vast majority of our stuff is going to be stuff that we link out to, but we do have some collections that are materials that we have created in-house, and we would want to have the license apply to those. So I guess we either do it as a separate collection for the items that are created in-house as opposed to those that are linked out to, or we rewrite some sort of license that says if this, if that, in order to cover ourselves in both kinds of instances.
Right, and that's actually what some institutions do, is they have one single deposit license that basically changes it into an or rather than an and. So it's like you represent that this submission is your original work, or you have the right to submit it, or deposit, or you have the right to make it available, or link to it, or something like that. You just tweak the text a little bit there to allow you that multiple option. So it kind of depends on how you're using your individual repository, and that's kind of why we're encouraging each of our customers to create your own deposit license. This is the default one that DSpace comes with, mainly because this is the license that MIT uses. And so it's kind of the MIT license with some generic text put into it. But MIT is not the same as every other institution. So other institutions obviously tweak the license based on the type of content they're putting in. And the example of the collection thing is that you can tweak it to the point of having different collections have different licenses, or you can just tweak your license to be more generic overall. It's kind of up to you. Does that make sense?
And so but you're saying that the license applies to the collection and not to the individual metadata records.
No, the license applies to the metadata record, but it's changeable at the collection level. So each collection can have a different license.
Do you change it, or do you change it?
This is something that you can change yourself. We have to change the default one, so the overarching site-wide one. You can just give us that basic text, and we will change that one for you. That was part of the setup process. And you can still tweak that, and that's something, if you wanted to tweak, you just send us updates to it. But then if you have individual collections that you want to be different than that default one, you can tweak that at the collection level yourself.
Okay.
All right. And let me grant this, and we'll go back to that collection page. So I'm going to go and complete the submission. Sure. So if we went back to that collection page and edit our collection, this license box here lets you tweak the license for the collection. If it's empty, then it'll just use the default one that is at the site-wide level. But if you want a different collection to have a different deposit license, you can put that text here. So that's another option for you. Okay, so let's see. Back to where we were at. So if I go back to, here's my collection we were messing around with, the mathematics topic or whatever, and here's the submission that I just completed. as you see, it's immediately into the system and it's immediately publicly available, so I can download the PDF, or the PowerPoint in this case. If I had put an approval process at the collection level, again, that's a collection level thing you can do. If there was approval process in place, then it would have gone into a holding queue and waited for an individual from the approval group to go in and actually approve or reject it, or edit the metadata. There were the different steps there that you could do. But by default, it's just going to go right into the system and become publicly available. So here's the default sort of splash page for an item. And so if you search for an item within the DSpace system, this is the page that you would be sent to, which would have the metadata information as well as the individual files, if there were individual files that could be downloaded. And when Google indexes DSpace, sometimes it will pop you into this splash page for the item. Other times it will actually give you a direct link right to the file itself, depending on whether Google can find the file and the format of the file. So Google also tries to index these very heavily, and DSpace makes sure that its metadata is in a format that Google and Yahoo and Bing and all those various search engines can capture very easily. So then if I go into edit this item, I wanted to show off what options are available in the editing aspect. So editing an item offers several different tabs. Again, you got this tab sort of interface. At the top level is just sort of some basic summary information about when this was last modified. Every item that gets put into DSpace gets its own unique identifier, which is called the handle, and that actually provides a persistent link to that particular item, and this is where that persistent URL comes into play. So if I go back to the item page, actually, there's a persistent URL that has been auto-generated for this particular item, that is this particular one, this handle. And if you clicked on this handle, it would automatically redirect us right back to this particular item within our demo.DSpaceDirect instance. But it allows you sort of a layer to be able to allow you to change your URLs at your site. So if I change this to be a totally different site name, if it became, I don't know, sample.whatever.com or whatever, you could point that handle.net URI, persistent URI, to that new location, and all of your old links would still work. So it's kind of a feature that's a part of DSpace and that we provide through DSpaceDirect. With the item status, then, there's several options with managing an individual item. You could change its authorization rights. So if you decided later on that you needed to restrict some access of this item or open it back up, you could change the authorization rights through that link. If the item is, for some reason, needs to be taken out of DSpace temporarily or even permanently, you can withdraw it from the system. This is actually a thing that can be undone. You can undo it. So you can withdraw this particular item. If I click on it, it'll actually ask me whether I want to withdraw. And once it's withdrawn, then I can reinstate it if I want to. Withdrawing it essentially takes it out of the system and puts it into a temporary sort of bucket so that it's no longer searchable through the system and you can no longer access the files. So it's basically invisible at this point in time. And it allows you an option to be able to either remove stuff if there was a copyright complaint, or you can remove it temporarily and reinstate it later on if you realize that you messed up something that really shouldn't be made publicly available and you want to tweak it a little bit before you go back and reinstate it. But reinstating it would then make it publicly available again back within the system. You can move items between collections. So if you accidentally put it in the wrong place, you can move it to another location. You can make the item private, and this can also be undone. It's similar to the withdrawal aspect, but it doesn't. It basically makes it private, but also still makes it searchable within the system to administrators. So it's a sort of different sort of aspect of the withdrawal, whereas withdrawal takes it even out of the search engine. You can also completely delete the item if you want to permanently get rid of it. If you permanently delete an individual item, we won't be able to restore it except from a backup. So this is something you only really want to do if you absolutely need to, and you know it never needs to be restored. If you think that there could be a case where you might want to put it back into place, it's recommended to either withdraw it, which takes it out of your search engine altogether, or do the making it private, where it still is searchable, but it's only available to admins. So that's kind of the basics at the item level. You can add new bit streams or files. You can see the original PDF or PowerPoint. I keep saying PDF. The original PowerPoint that was added. Another thing to note here is with that deposit license, when a deposit license is signed off during that deposit process, a copy of that deposit license gets added to this individual item. So this license.txt file is a copy of that license that I agreed to. And it's actually kind of electronically signed with my email address and the date that I agreed to that particular deposit license. So it allows you to have a copy of that license. Even if you decide later on to change it, you have a historical record of what the license was when this particular item was added to the system. And so from here you can add more files to the system. If there was multiple within a certain bundle, which I'll talk about in a moment, then you can reorganize them. And that allows you to decide how they appear on the actual page within the system. So if you had a PowerPoint and a PDF and maybe even a video all within the same item, you can decide which one appears first in the download list as the most important of those files, essentially. There's also the ability to manage things through this idea of bundles is essentially a DSpace grouping of files. The only bundle you guys would ever really mess around with for the most part is the one called the original bundle, which is basically the files that are there for download. Those are the ones that appear on an individual item page when people search for an item. The license bundle, of course, contains license files. There are other bundles that will be auto-created by DSpace by default based on the type of content, and they're kind of ones that are built on a case-by-case basis, so that if you had uploaded some image files, then you may see a bundle appear that's called thumbnail, which essentially DSpace will automatically create thumbnails of image files for you. And so those thumbnails are just kind of stuck in a different bundle because they're kind of copies of those original images but created in a thumbnail form. In addition, if you upload a PDF or a Word document, DSpace will extract the text, the plain text of the Word document or the PDF, and create a text bundle. And that basically is kind of a preservation tool. It allows you to have a plain text version of the file should the original get corrupted in some way. It also is a tool for the DSpace search engine, so that when you're searching DSpace from the search box up here, it's able to search the full text of the entire document as well. So you can search within documents. So that's kind of how files are managed in DSpace. At any time you can go back and tweak the metadata. This particular metadata editing tool is the plain Dublin Core, so it's not as pretty looking as the submission process. It gives you a lot more control, but because it's giving you more control, you're kind of trusted to kind of add and tweak things just as best as you can. So it's very, very trusting of the individual user. But you will notice there are fields that DSpace has automatically filled out here and captured as things were added into the system. So things like the date that this individual item became publicly available on the web, the date that you actually submitted this within to DSpace. There's also provenance information here that is captured. So in this case, since I submitted it from the UI, it's captured my name, the demo administrator account, and the email address associated with that, and the number of files that I had uploaded at the point in time that I had put this into the system. In the case of the migrating content from one system to another, these provenance fields would actually include links of where the content was migrated from and the date that it was migrated. So you can actually get that information about the provenance. And then you see when it was made publicly available, which was the same date that I submitted it, since there was no approval workflow. And you can actually see those steps where I had withdrawn it temporarily, and then I reinstated it later on, and the dates and times that I had done that process as well. So any of those fields are editable here through this interface, or you can even add additional fields as well if you wanted to. At any point in time, if you've tweaked anything here, the View Item tab allows you to review your changes, essentially, see a preview of what it's going to look like when it's in the DSpace system. And then that Curate tab provides those same sort of reporting options, just at an item level. It's less useful for a lot of the reporting tools, but it's very useful when you add like DuraCloud on the back end, because then you could restore individual items or things like that, restore them from backup. So that's the basics of editing an item as well. And let's see, the last thing we need, well, a few more things to talk through briefly. And go ahead.
One quick thing, Tim, I just wanted to do a time check. We're at 3:45. So just wanted to give folks the heads up, and I'm assuming we're going to try to wrap up right around 4 o'clock Eastern Time.
Yeah, that's my goal.
Okay.
If we can. Is everybody okay with that? I'm assuming?
Yes.
Okay.
No complaints here.
Okay. Yep. Okay, so a couple other things to talk through here. As I had mentioned, you can obviously add more accounts into the DSpace system through this access control area. You can add both people and then group people into groups of users so that you can give them permissions within individual communities, collections, and even individual items. So by default, DSpace manages all of its user accounts internally within the system. If you had any sort of external authentication system, like some universities have, like an LDAP system or other sort of external authentication system, DSpace can hook into those, but by default it's just going to create its own accounts internally and manage all of its permissions internal to the system. So there's just a bunch of test users here that have been created over time, and you can at any time create a brand new user into the system. You can also ask people to just go and register within the system. As I'd mentioned, anybody can go and register within the DSpace system to sign up with a new account. So that's another way of getting accounts into the system. But individual accounts, essentially, if I click on my own account here, they consist of your email address, which is your username within DSpace. Your name you want to be known by, which ends up appearing up in the profile area up top. And then there's options here from the administrative aspect. You can do things like reset their password. You could delete the person altogether if they no longer need to have an account. Or you can just make it so they cannot log in if for some reason you didn't want to delete them but you don't want them to be able to log in anymore. It also gives you a summary of their rights within the system. So it tells you what communities you have admin rights on or collections you have admin rights, what other collections you are or other groups you may be a part of within the actual DSpace system. So an admin can manage all of these user accounts at any point in time. That's only the site-wide admin. Community-level admins and collection-level admins cannot manage these user accounts. It's just that site-wide admin. And as I'd mentioned, if I log out here, there is the registration process is usually the easiest way to add new accounts in, because it lets individual users just add their own account and set up their password all in one sort of quick workflow. And so when you register, you can just add an email address into here. Once you add an email address, DSpace will automatically send you an email at that point in time with a link that you have to click to verify that this email address is valid. It's just ensuring that spammers and the like can't get in necessarily as easily with fake email addresses. So you'll have to go to your email and validate your email address, and then at that point in time you'll be sent to a create profile page where you can actually set up your password within the system and all that sort of stuff. And then after that you're finished with the actual registration process, but as I had mentioned, it doesn't give you any extra rights into the system until an administrator gives you those rights. And that's all pretty much managed via those groups and via those roles. So I'm going to sign back in. Yeah, go ahead.
The registration, is that something that is visible to anybody in the world who comes to our DSpace instance?
Yes. Yes, it is.
And so anybody in the world can register?
They can register an account, but by default, the only thing they can do with that account is they can request to be sent an email if new stuff gets put into your system. That's all they can do. They have no rights otherwise inside there, but they can register within their system. So that's just kind of the way DSpace works. It's just the easiest way to get accounts added, and it also does mean that anybody in the world could add accounts, but it does involve a multi-stage process there where when they register, they do have to go check their email then and click on a particular link there in order to actually create the account. That basically ensures that spammers can't go out there and try and auto-create a ton of accounts all at once across all these DSpace sites. That won't work because of the fact that they have to go in and validate their email address. So, but it does allow anybody in the world to register.
Yeah, we haven't thought about this. We haven't discussed this, but is it possible to basically delete that link if we wanted to, so that if we wanted to, nobody could register? Basically, we would control who is getting access to the site.
Yeah, that's something we should be able to tweak for you if you wanted to not allow anybody to register at all, period. I'd have to look into it.
I don't know. We haven't discussed this. We don't. We have particular thoughts in mind concerning how we want to use this, but so we can talk about this and decide whether it's an issue for us or not.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that's perfectly fine. I think it's something that we could figure out to clear out that link or hide that link in some way, shape, or form if you wanted it to be done. I will note that most universities leave that link in place just because of the fact that even if somebody does register with an account, they can't do anything with it until you give them rights. So it's not a security concern in any way, shape, or form, but if you didn't want it to be there, we could look into a way to remove that link or hide the link in some way.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So that's kind of how you get people into the system. You can add people manually from this process here where you can actually add their email address, first name, last name. The telephone number is usually more used at universities where if an administrator wants you to enter in your contact number so they can get a hold of you, you can enter it, but it's totally optional. A lot of institutions don't even use it because they may have a different telephone directory. But all that information is available here from the admin side. It's one thing to note, it looks like it's going to be improved in the next version of DSpace, which is coming out later this fall. But currently from this screen, as you can see, there's no way to set the password, which is kind of a silly sort of thing, but we're working on fixing up hopefully for this fall. Essentially the process would be that if you wanted to create new users manually, you create the account to begin with. I'm going to cancel out of that just for time's sake. And then once the account's created, you can go in and just do a reset password, which automatically notifies them via email and lets them set up their own password. So it's kind of a weird workaround of getting their password set up, but we're working on a way to make that much more streamlined in the next version of DSpace. Just wanted to let you know if you're adding accounts manually that's slightly confusing in that way. Okay, so that's adding accounts. Once you have accounts in the system, there's also then the idea of groups. So as I had shown you, there's groups that manage roles within the system, and those are all these oddly named groups, and they're all linked off to the collection or the community that they're related to. And the naming of the group gives you an idea of what that group refers to, what it actually offers. What permissions it gives them. You can manage these groups from this group management tool. You can also manage them, as you saw, from going to the community editing tool or the collection editing tool. And sometimes it's actually easier to edit them from the community or collection editing tool because there's more explanatory text there around how to do it. But you can edit them either way. It's also worth noting you can create your own groups for your own purposes. So you can create a group, whatever you want to call it. It just needs to have some sort of name. So I could create one called NCAC staff or whatever if you wanted to create that. And I'll delete this group afterwards, but I can add members right away here. So you can add groups into groups, or you can add people into the group. So you could select from various people, or you can leave the group empty and go back and edit it later on. But essentially you can add as many groups as you want into the system. And at any point in time, then you can use those groups to dole out those different rights at different community levels or different collection levels. So if you wanted to, or even at the site-wide level, if you wanted your entire staff to have admin rights, you could actually create a group called, staff or whatever, and then you could go into, I cancel out of this for now, you can go into the overarching administrator group and add that group into there, whatever that group may be. And give them rights, or you can add individual members to it. So that's just the way you manage permissions within DSpace via these groups. And I often do recommend to people that it's worthwhile creating groups within DSpace just because it sometimes makes permission management a little bit easier, especially if you create things like a staff group. That way you don't have to add each individual staff member to every single little group that they need to belong to. You can just create one staff group, stick them all in that staff group, and then add that staff group to all of the groups that it needs permissions for, whether that's administrator or certain duties or certain collections. It sometimes just makes the process a little bit easier. But that's how you do rights managements, permission managements within DSpace via those people and those groups. And so the last few things I do want to mention briefly. There are some other administrative tools here. Most of them you're really not going to touch upon much at all, but they're worth mentioning. There is the ability to tweak the metadata fields within DSpace, but the important thing here, and we did put a note within everybody's site, that if you tweak the metadata fields, we're going to have to do some back-end stuff to actually make sure those metadata fields get put on the correct submission forms or anything like that. So while you can tweak metadata fields, they don't become usable in the system until you let us know what changes you want in place. There's also an items searching feature for administrators. Go ahead.
Could you clarify that a little further?
Sure.
If for example, we wanted to tweak the metadata, I'm sorry. I was thinking about the metadata for individual records, but what you're talking about is the overall
this is the overall metadata in DSpace. You can actually tweak it from the admin side, the entire Dublin core. You could add new Dublin core fields or actually add a brand new metadata schema. But if you added new fields overarching, they're not used by the system until DuraSpace enables them within individual deposit forms, or if you want it to be a searchable field or anything like that. DSpace just doesn't know what to do with it until you configure it, essentially. So it's something that you probably won't really use, but I just wanted to let you know that it's there, and we do have a note here to please contact DuraSpace if you'd like to add new fields. So we tried to make that as clear as possible up there at the top. There's also the ability, if you withdraw items, you can immediately browse those items there as an administrator or the private items. The control panel is more of an informational area, but it's actually what DuraSpace uses to let you know about any downtime, if there's anything that we need to let you know about, like if we have to do some sort of maintenance behind the scenes. There's actually a tool here that I use to let people know if maintenance is going to be happening. So I can activate this maintenance message, and it will appear on every single page across your entire DSpaceDirect site, so that it warns you if there's a maintenance period coming up. Other than that, the control panel is more just informational in nature, though it does let you see what current activity is going on in your system if you wanted to. Just to see who's logged in, who's using things. But it's mostly stuff that DuraSpace will manage for you here. There are, let's see, two other things. Let me go back to the home page. Yeah, okay. So the home page, once I've logged in, there's a statistics field that allows us to view some usage statistics within DSpace. At the home page, these are going to be site-wide statistics, and so it provides you information about who has actually viewed particular items and what are the most viewed items within your DSpace instance. And it's very general at the site level, but you get more specific statistics as you go down. So if I go back here to our statistics, there's also search statistics, so what people have searched for within DSpace. So if people came to your search box and typed in search phrases, it'll let you know what they searched for. And then workflow statistics, which lets you know the approval process. If you're using that approval workflow process, then you'll get some basic statistics around that approval process. By default, these statistics are only available to administrative users. Those are site-wide administrators, or you can get community and collection statistics for community and collection administrators. So they aren't available to the public at all. If you wanted to, some sites actually do like them to be available to anybody. And we can enable that. It's a simple tweak, but it's not necessary. It's totally up to you how you guys want to use it. But again, as you're browsing through the system, these statistics links change based on where you are in the system. So if I go to our sample community, and actually it's cached here. It looks like my browser, local browser cached it, so I got to refresh. Okay, so if I go to the actual community, I'll get more information about the views at the community level and even the visits over time over the last 6 months, as well as where people are coming from in the world. You'll get similar statistics at the collection level. You can also go down to an individual item. So let me go to Browse by Title. Let's go to a item, and we go down to our statistics. And in an individual item, then I can see how many people have viewed that particular page. If anybody had downloaded files, since this is the demo site, we don't have very good statistics showing up here. But if anybody had downloaded the files, you'd see the number of file downloads, where people have come from in the world, and actually viewed this particular item. So it gives you some basic usage statistics at all levels within the system. And that feature is constantly being enhanced.
China has already found it.
Yeah, somebody in China has already found this demo site, I guess.
Yeah, they run a lot of bots over there.
Yeah, but so those are the basic usage statistics that are available within DSpace. Those are constantly being enhanced in new versions of DSpace, and as new versions come out, these will surely get enhanced over time because they've been enhanced over the last few releases of DSpace as well. The final thing to mention, at the community and collection level, there is the capability to do bulk metadata editing. I'm not going to give a full demo of this right now because it's a little bit, it could be its own talk in itself. But the knowledge base that I showed you a link to, as well as we'll send you a link in an email afterwards, has actually a very good video demonstration and a PowerPoint demonstration of how to utilize the bulk metadata editing tool. It's basically a way to allow you to just edit metadata across either your entire system or across individual communities or collections to kind of clean things up if you know things are a little bit messy or whatever. So there's a lot of ways that it can come in handy. But the way it works is at communities and at collection levels, there's this export metadata tool. And what that actually does is it's going to export a CSV file, which is just got auto-downloaded to my system. A CSV file is essentially an Excel spreadsheet that you can edit in Microsoft Excel, and it's got all of the metadata for all of the items within that community or within that collection, everything underneath it. So then you can go into that Excel spreadsheet and tweak the metadata using Excel's tools to do tweaking of various columns. Once you're done tweaking that metadata and you're at a place where you want to update DSpace with it, then you go back and you do an import of the metadata, which is right down here. And that importing tool lets you choose your CSV file and import it and upload it back into the system. Before it'll apply the changes, though, when you upload, it'll first do a scan and give you a summary of all of the changes that it sees. So then you can go through that summary and you can say, okay, these look right. Or if something looks really out of place, you can cancel out and do some further tweaks. But it allows you to tweak the metadata in a much more bulk fashion using the tools provided by Microsoft Excel. There's a lot more ways you can use that.
So can you give an example of when you would do something like that, a specific example? Are you talking about something like you have a descriptor that you have, or 2 or 3 descriptors that have been used, and you would like to make sure that only one descriptor is being used instead, and you do sort of a search and replace type thing? Is that what you're talking about?
Yep. Yeah, you could do that, or say you had chosen certain standard subject terms that you wanted to start out with right now, and then later on you decide that one of them wasn't specific enough, and so you want to update the 500 items that are in your system that had this old subject term. Rather than going to each item individually and trying to update them one by one, you could do a bulk metadata export, change that term within that Excel spreadsheet, and then re-import it, and DSpace will recognize that term change and apply it to all 500 of those items at once. So it's things like that. There's all kinds of useful ways to do it. It's also useful if you were actually importing individual items that were metadata only. So if you're wanting to just have a bunch of items that just link off to stuff elsewhere, you could actually end up creating an Excel spreadsheet of that metadata of this specific format, and then upload just that Excel spreadsheet, and you can create brand new items within DSpace using this as well. But it's metadata only items that it would create. So, but there's a lot of ways you can use it, and like I said, there's a much better tutorial that we'll send you a link to that actually goes through examples of all of these ways you can use it. It's not just for even bulk editing, but also for importing new metadata-only items and other things you could do with it as well. It's its own training session in itself. You could spend an hour talking on it. But I just wanted to make you aware of how it generally works, the very basics of it, and we'll send you some links on the much more detailed tutorials that you could go through. And with that, that's really the last thing that I wanted to give you a demo of here. I know we're a little bit past 4 Eastern here, but that's the end of the live demo, and I'll go straight here to the thank you, which has the link to the DSpaceDirect knowledge base. We'll send you that as well as if you have questions going forward on this training session or anything in the knowledge base or suggestions, we have this support email address set up as well, where you can email us at our support email, and we'll get back to you as quickly as we can. And I'll turn it back over to Carissa at this point in time, or open it up for questions, both.
Hey Tim, yeah, we have a question here.
Just a quick question. So all the data that was migrated over, are we able to edit it just the same way as you were showing us how to edit the new records that I created?
Correct. Yes. Yeah. Those metadata records will be the exact same way as the ones that we just created now. You can edit any metadata record one by one, or you could bulk export them to the Excel spreadsheet format and edit them in bulk.
And that's what you did with the AND symbol, correct?
Exactly. Yep. I did a bulk export to Excel and then used Excel tools to get rid of those weird characters and then re-imported it. That's exactly how I cleaned it up. Yep.
Great.
Thank you. This is very thorough.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
If there are any more questions from folks, please don't hesitate to contact us via the support email if you have any follow-up questions after today. I will be sending out an email with a bunch of references to the knowledge base URL that you see, the support email address, the link to this particular recording, which will be located on YouTube, as well as a couple other references and a login to the demo DSpaceDirect site that Tim was using today. So you can use that as a sandbox before you start to add content to your own DSpaceDirect account. But with that, I'd just like to say thank you for the great questions today. I think this was an absolutely exceptional training session, so I thank you all for your questions as well as your participation.
Yeah, this was very helpful, and I think that Muriel now knows everything to do, and I think we're that certainly helps bring us all up to a basic level of knowledge anyway. I'm sure that we'll have some more questions as we go along, but there are a lot of similarities between this and CWIS that we've been working with in the past. And so I think we're in pretty good shape as far as Muriel. Do you feel like there's anything in particular here that you need a little bit more explanation of?
At this point, I think I'm fine. We just have a few things that we'll go over, yeah, we're good. Thank you.
Okay, I guess one of the questions that we'll need to deal with first, once you are ready to go live with this, or maybe before, is to decide how you want to deal with who is an administrator to begin with, so that we can then add other people with administrative permissions. But I think that's something that we can talk about as we move along.
Right.
Well, again,
so
thank you all.
This was very helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your Monday. And if you have any feedback whatsoever about the training session itself, or if you think about content that you wish we had covered, or other things that you would like to see us cover in future training sessions, please let me know. Other than that, thank you all, and I will be in touch via email.